a young man named Sam Walton, in 1918, in a United States that was still tasting a bitter victory after the First World War, and was entering fully into the era of large factories and dirt roads in small towns. A child named Sam Walton was born on a small farm in Oklahoma, surrounded by fields, animals, and the constant feeling that money was always one step ahead of the family, that one had to run hard to catch it. And in that environment of early mornings, cows to milk, and accounts to balance at the end of each month, the character of someone was being shaped who, without knowing it, would eventually change the way millions of people around the world shop. Before continuing, I am very curious to know from which place in the world and at what time you are joining tonight. I would love to read you in the comments. And now, yes, let us dive fully into the life of this man. From a young age, Sam understood that work was not an abstract idea, but something that was felt in the shoulders and hands, because the family moved several times in search of better opportunities. And each change of house meant starting over, new neighbors, new routines, and the same underlying problem. Money had to be brought home no matter what, and it was there that the first trace of a miniature entrepreneur appeared when he began delivering newspapers, selling milk from the family cows, and taking on that mixture of responsibility and ambition that is so rarely seen in a child. A boy who quickly learned that if he wanted something, he could not sit and wait for it to arrive. While other teenagers spent time idly, he observed how much each customer paid, which routes were more efficient for delivering newspapers, how many minutes he lost if he stopped to chat, and without knowing it, he was training exactly the skill that would become his main weapon years later. An obsession with the details that affect sales, costs, and the customer experience, all wrapped in a practical, unadorned mindset that led him to constantly ask himself how to do the same with less effort and better results, something his mother reinforced with her insistence that the family maintain a certain dignity and good image even when money was not enough. Because that too was a lesson. The customer, the neighbor, the boss, everyone keeps an impression, and that impression lasts a long time. His time in high school showed a Sam who combined work with leadership, participated in activities, joined sports, tried to stand out academically, not because he had a clear master plan for the future, but because he seemed unable to settle for being just another person, and that discomfort with mediocrity led him to university, something that, in that context, was already a significant social leap, because it meant leaving behind the logic of farm life and aspiring to something different, to a job where both the head and the hands were used. And there, in the classrooms and hallways, that strange combination between country boy and natural leader began to form, someone who understood at the same time the needs of the worker and the aspirations of the business owner. When the Second World War arrived, his life shifted again, like that of an entire generation, and Sam served in the army, where he did not become an epic movie hero, but he did learn something that would be vital: the discipline of processes, the importance of logistics, the value of every piece of the system knowing exactly what to do and when to do it. A silent lesson that he would later apply to something as seemingly simple as moving boxes from a warehouse to a store, even though behind that gesture there was a fine engineering that separated a mediocre shop from a giant of retail. Upon returning to civilian life, still young and with a mixture of urgency and hunger for results, Sam did not remain paralyzed. He looked for opportunities and ended up entering the world of retail through franchise stores of Ben Franklin, a type of variety store that already had presence at the time, with clear rules and a proven model, something that would have been enough for many to feel comfortable and satisfied with having a stable business. But for him, it became a testing ground in which he observed the way products were displayed, the margins applied, the reaction of customers when prices were adjusted, and the impact that a small decision had on the cash register at the end of the day. None of this happened in a theoretical way. He was not doing exercises on a chalkboard. He was at the counter, greeting people, helping load bags, taking note of what people asked for and could not find, mentally tracking which products moved quickly and which were left sleeping on the shelves. And it was there that his great conviction began to take shape. If you want to sell more, you have to understand the customer better than your competition does. And to understand them, you have to be close, listen, observe, live the daily life of the business as if you were both employee and owner at the same time. A balance that many forget when they grow, but that he made an effort to maintain. That learning came with enormous frustration when, after turning a store into a success thanks to his ideas and work, he discovered that, because of a contract clause and the ownership of the building, he lost the right to renew, and, in practice, he was expelled from the small empire he had built himself, forcing him to start from zero. An experience that would have destroyed the motivation of anyone, but that in his case worked as an accelerator, a confirmation that he had the instinct to build something big, even if he had not yet found the right structure for that growth to depend on him and his family, and not on an owner who could change the rules overnight. That fall hurt him, of course, because he saw how others kept the harvest of his effort. But it also forced him to rethink the type of businesses he wanted to participate in, to search for models where he could have more control over the concept, the suppliers, and the operations. And above all, it strengthened the idea that the talent for selling and for managing people was a kind of muscle that no one could take away from him, even if he lost a store, even if he had to move to another town, even if he had to take out loans and convince new partners, because what truly set him apart was not in the contract, but in his head and in his way of working. At this point in the story, the character was no longer simply a farm boy helping his family make ends meet, but a merchant with scars, someone who had experienced both success and business injustice, who knew both sides of the warehouse door, the reality of the employee and the concern of the owner, and that double perspective allowed him to understand that a store was not only a place where products were displayed, it was a living mechanism where the interests of customers, workers, suppliers, and owners coexisted, and if one of those elements broke, the whole system suffered. At the same time, his experience pushed him toward a simple and revolutionary idea. Many people earned little, needed to buy a lot, and appreciated finding a place where everything was a little cheaper without having to chase temporary promotions, which meant that if you found a way to systematically reduce your costs and pass that saving on to the final price, you could get people to become recurring, almost loyal customers, because they felt that this business was on their side in the daily battle to make it to the end of the month, a profoundly practical but also emotional vision that would become the heart of his business philosophy. Thus, we reach a Sam Walton, who was no longer a mere entrepreneur, experimenting in other people's stores, but someone who had accumulated enough knowledge, mistakes, and small victories to begin thinking about a model of his own, a commercial structure that reflected his convictions about consistently low prices, closeness to the small-town customer, and a firm control of the numbers. And at the moment he decided to take that next step, the story stopped being the tale of a man who learned and became that of a merchant who created, who opened his own space and used it as a laboratory for an experiment that, in time, would grow far beyond the dimensions he had imagined, because the next chapter in this story would be precisely that. The birth of his own 5 and 10-cent store, in a small town, where every shelf and every box of inventory would become pieces of a much larger game that was about to begin. The Waltons' 5 and Donizero experiment. When Sam Walton arrives in Bentonville, Arkansas, in the early 1950s, he does not arrive as a triumphant man seeking to crown his career. He arrives as a man who has just received a serious blow, forced to leave behind a successful store because of a poorly designed contract, carrying in his suitcase a mixture of restrained anger, commercial experience, and an almost stubborn determination to prove that he can build something even bigger. And that mental state is key to understanding what is about to happen on a small street in a town that, at that moment, did not even appear on the mental maps of the country's major business leaders. Bentonville is not a large industrial city. It is a quiet town, with a slow rhythm and an economy that revolves around farmers, local merchants, and families who look at their budgets before every purchase. And that seemingly modest environment becomes the perfect stage for Sam's new experiment, because there he decides to buy a variety store and transform it into his own commercial laboratory, a place he names Walton's 5 and Donizero, a reference to the classic model of 5 and 10-cent stores, where the promise is clear: to find everyday products at prices that seem almost impossible. The store does not begin with fireworks or with a huge budget. It begins with creativity and an intelligent use of every dollar, with shelves that are reorganized again and again, handwritten signs that are changed frequently, and an owner who walks up and down the aisles analyzing the flow of people, noticing where they stop, what they pick up, what they put back, and what they ignore, because for him, That small store is more than a way to make a living. It is a system that can be adjusted, a machine that can work a little better every day if one knows how to read what is happening between 8 in the morning and closing time. From the very beginning, Walton turns the customer experience into a kind of silent obsession. He cares about greeting people, about learning names, about remembering who has children, who lives on which farm or in which neighborhood, and that close treatment is accompanied by a very specific idea. A small-town store does not need to be a boring place. It can become a lively space, with promotions, with new products that awaken curiosity, and with a sense of abundance even when the inventory is limited. Something he achieves by playing with the way he places merchandise, how he fills the shelves, how he uses vertical space so it looks as if there is always more than what actually exists in the stockroom. At the same time, Sam begins refining his philosophy about pricing. He no longer thinks about setting the margin that has always been used, simply because that is how commerce is done. He asks himself how much he can reduce it without losing money, if, in exchange, he manages to get people to shop more frequently and in larger quantities, and that mentality of volume, of constant rotation, clashes with the habits of many merchants of the time who preferred to sell fewer units with more margin, while he chooses the opposite path, selling a lot, very fast, and letting profits come through accumulation, supported by meticulous cost management. To sustain that strategy, it is not enough to put labels with lower numbers. He needs to negotiate with suppliers, seek conditions that allow him to lower prices without destroying the accounting books. And that leads him to do something that, for many shopkeepers, would be unthinkable. Traveling to study other stores, exploring markets, observing how discount chains that were emerging in different regions of the country operated, taking notes, copying ideas he considers brilliant, and adapting them to his reality in Bentonville with a practical humility that prevents him from believing himself an original genius and encourages him to learn from anyone who is doing something that works. In that process, his store begins to stand out in the area. People comment that at Walton's 5 and Done is Zero, they find lower prices and a certain different energy, a mixture of order and movement, because he introduces small innovations that, although they may sound obvious today, were almost revolutionary in that context, such as placing high-rotation products near the entrance, creating visually clear sections so customers do not get lost, taking advantage of weekends to launch specific offers, and turning the act of shopping into a recurring habit incorporated into the town's routine. His relationship with his team also becomes a central piece of the experiment. Sam does not behave like a distant boss who watches from the back office. He works side by side with the employees. He asks for their opinions. He demands from them, of course, but at the same time he transmits the feeling that they are part of something that can grow, that they are not simply selling products, but building a store that can make a difference in the community, and that shared feeling makes the internal culture intense, with meetings, with constant corrections, with praise when appropriate, and with a permanent expectation of improvement. In parallel, his obsession with numbers, with concrete results, becomes stronger, and the store fills with notebooks, handmade spreadsheets, sales records, comparisons between days, between weeks, between months, because for him intuition has value. But it must be validated or corrected with data. Even if that data arrives through sums on paper and not through computer systems, which means that every important decision relies on the combination of what he sees behind the counter and what the figures show him when he stays late reviewing the accounting. This approach allows him to detect patterns that other merchants overlook, such as the importance of adjusting the assortment to seasonality, of anticipating certain purchases to save on costs, of introducing products that have not yet been seen in other stores in the area, and his store becomes a place where people get used to finding surprises, but always under the same underlying promise. The price will be reasonable, the treatment will be correct, and the feeling upon leaving will be that of having used their money well. While Bentonville begins integrating the presence of Walton's 5 and Done is Zero as part of its daily landscape, in Sam's mind, an idea begins to take shape that is no longer limited to that store. He starts asking himself how this model would work if he had several stores connected to each other. If he used the same logic of rotation, adjusted prices, and customer proximity in different towns, and that leads him to think about more efficient supply systems, about wholesale purchases that allow him to obtain significant discounts, about the need for centralized inventory control, even when the stores are distributed across different localities in the region. Every small adjustment, every conversation with a customer, every negotiation with a supplier is building a kind of mental map of discount retail in his head, and that map is no longer satisfied with the scale of a traditional variety store. It begins pointing toward something different, toward larger spaces, toward a wider assortment, and toward a structure that combines the advantages of small-town commerce with an operational efficiency typical of large chains. If we look with perspective, Walton's 5&0 was much more than a successful store in a small town in Arkansas. It was the scaled-down model of a business concept that was going to push to the limit the idea of selling at low prices every day. A testing ground in which Sam allowed himself to experiment, to make mistakes, and to correct quickly without losing sight of the goal of attracting and retaining a customer who was extremely sensitive to price. And everything he learned within those walls, among wooden shelves and boxes full of everyday products, would become the foundation of his next leap. Because, at a certain point, that small 5 and 10-cent store was no longer enough to contain his ambitions, and the logic of low prices, of volume, and of obsessive attention to the customer would begin to seek a larger stage, a new kind of establishment in which that philosophy could unfold with all its strength. The year Walmart is born. In 1962, while in the United States people were talking about the space race, the first journeys into space, and a country that was looking toward big cities, Sam Walton had his eyes set on something that seemed far less epic, although with time it would prove to be just as transformative. The secondary highways of the South, small towns, gravel parking lots in front of simple buildings, and above all, the tight budgets of families who wanted to buy more things than their salaries allowed, and who were used to resigning themselves to prices that no one had bothered to question for decades. After squeezing the experience of Walton's 5 and 10 to its limits, Sam realizes that the variety store model is starting to feel too small for him. He senses that the formula can be expanded into something larger, with more assortment, more square footage, and a much more aggressive bet on price. And at that moment, he comes into contact with the idea of the discount store, the discount shops that were beginning to appear in different parts of the country and that broke with the traditional logic of retail, betting on lower margins and selling in volume to customers who traveled to them precisely because of that promise of savings. In large metropolitan areas, that concept was already being tested by stronger chains, but Sam, faithful to his instinct, understands that the real opportunity is not in competing in the same cities, but in looking at the map and identifying those territories the big players had overlooked, the towns that lie halfway between one city and another, the rural communities that never quite fit into anyone's expansion plans, and there the idea appears that becomes the backbone of his strategy. Bringing a large discount store to places where no one had bothered to bring one. Building a big store in a small place. The first experiment of this new stage takes shape in Rogers, Arkansas, a town without major headlines or international airports, but with a base of potential customers Sam knows well, people who have no problem driving several miles if they feel the trip is worth it, and who value price as much as the feeling of being served in a familiar environment, without unnecessary luxuries, and with the certainty that if there are problems, the owner of the store will not be in another city, but relatively close by, probably walking the aisles with a notepad in hand. When he decides to open the first Walmart discount city, he does so in a simple building, without great architectural pretensions, with a large sign announcing the name separated by a hyphen and an interior that, compared to traditional small-town stores, feels enormous, a space that can hold rows of shelves, clearly defined sections, and a much broader assortment than any customer in the area was used to seeing, from clothing to household goods, including toys, tools, and seasonal products, all under the same promise. Consistently low prices, day after day. Making that concept work was not a linear or easy path, because to build that first store, Sam had to convince bankers, suppliers, and even people in his own circle, who looked skeptically at the idea of constructing such a large retail operation in an area that was far from being a capital city. And in those conversations, a scene repeats itself that says a great deal about his character, sitting across from bank executives, explaining that the trick would be to sell cheaper than everyone else, and managing, little by little, to earn their trust more through his track record as a tireless merchant than through the cold data of population size and average income in the area. Once the store opened, the next challenge was to translate that low-price philosophy on the ground, and this is where the practical decisions came into play that would define the Walmart style for decades, such as negotiating to the limit with suppliers to secure better terms, buying large volumes, even if that meant taking inventory risks, sacrificing part of the unit margin in exchange for moving enough merchandise, and organizing the store so that customers could walk through it easily, finding temptations in every aisle without getting lost in a chaotic maze. Inside the building, the atmosphere was far from the stereotype of a luxury store. There was simple lighting, unadorned ceilings, wide aisles, and a constant sense of functionality, almost like a warehouse open to the public, reinforced by the constant presence of employees restocking, helping, tagging items, while Sam moved among them with the natural ease of someone who feels part of the operational team, checking prices, asking about weekly sales, analyzing which products were beginning to stand out and which needed to be reconsidered. Customers began arriving from Rogers and from surrounding towns, some driving considerable distances because they had heard that prices at this new store were surprisingly low, and that flow of vehicles coming in and out of the parking lot became for Sam a thermometer of the concept's success, a sign that the sacrifice in margin was being compensated by an increasingly intense movement of goods, something the numbers confirmed when he sat down at the end of the day to review sales. On a cultural level, this first Walmart consolidated something that had already been taking shape since Bentonville. The idea that the store should be a living place, with a somewhat festive atmosphere on special days, with promotions announced in a rudimentary but effective way, and with a very close relationship between the business and the community, based on the fact that a large part of the staff came from the area and personally knew the customers, generating an emotional bond that went beyond the simple exchange of money for products. As the months passed, Sam began to see that the model not only worked, but contained within it a very clear potential for replication, because the formula could be repeated in any other town with similar characteristics: a medium-sized town, a rural area of influence, an absence of major discount competitors, and a population with enough accumulated purchasing power to sustain a large format store, as long as the fundamental principles were maintained, which were controlling costs, rotating inventory, and upholding the promise of low prices every day, without relying on occasional sales as a hook. That focus on consistent pricing, instead of playing with peaks of promotions, grew stronger in his mind as a kind of psychological contract with the customer, a way of saying, "Here you will not find tricks. You will not have to wait for a special day for us to give you a good price. You will have it every time you walk in." And that sense of security became a powerful weapon against competitors who continued to operate under a more traditional logic, based on big, punctual campaigns, more spectacular in advertising, but more unstable for the consumer's wallet. While the first Walmart in Rogers was consolidating, Sam did not limit himself to celebrating the figures. He kept observing, taking notes, and adjusting, asking himself how to improve restocking, what kinds of products to add to increase the average ticket, without betraying the essence of a discount store, and how to design internal processes that would allow, in the near future, the management of more than one store without losing control, because in his mind, the idea of expansion was already present, of bringing this type of store to other towns, forming a network that could benefit from joint purchasing and coordinated logistics. With that horizon in mind, the Rogers store became the starting point of something much bigger. The first visible piece of a plan that did not yet have a perfectly drawn map, but did have a very clear compass. To grow, yes, but without abandoning the towns forgotten by the big players, to maintain local roots while building an increasingly broad structure, and to make the word Walmart, which at that time meant nothing to most of the country, end up being associated with a very specific idea in the minds of millions of consumers. And while trucks unloaded boxes at the back, while the parking lot filled with dusty cars and families trying to stretch their paychecks, in Sam's thoughts the next stage of this story was already beginning to take shape, a phase in which that first store would no longer stand alone and new locations would begin to sprout, connected to one another, spreading across the South and consolidating a model that would soon demand a much more complex organization and a logistics system worthy of the ambition that was starting to take form. From Arkansas to the deep south of the United States, During the second half of the 1960s, while that first Walmart in Rogers was finishing its consolidation as a reference point for thousands of families, Sam Walton was already thinking about the next move, looking at the map of the southern United States with the same attention others devote to studying a financial report, mentally drawing circles around towns that seemed invisible to the large city department stores, but that to him were true diamonds in the rough, entire communities accustomed to settling for limited options and high prices because nobody had ever dared to bet big on them. The logic guiding his decisions seemed simple on paper, although in practice it required considerable courage. Instead of competing for wealthy areas, Sam focused on small towns in Arkansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, Kansas, Tennessee, or Louisiana, places where the census did not impress the banks and where consultants would never have recommended opening a large store, and yet he interpreted those same numbers differently, seeing entire regions without a single discount department store, long distances to the nearest city, and a population of farmers, workers, and employees with a constant consumption pattern, people who needed basic products every week and who would appreciate finding a place where their money went further. As he opened new stores, Sam's life became a kind of permanent tour along secondary roads, at first driving thousands of kilometers in his own car, and later piloting small airplanes to save time, because he wanted to see the stores with his own eyes, walk the aisles, talk to the managers, feel the atmosphere of each location, observe whether the essence he had imagined for Walmart stayed alive in that specific corner of the deep south of the United States, or whether it was beginning to fade among routines and neglect. In those visits, a particular culture was born, almost a shared ritual, made of meetings in modest rooms, early breakfasts with the team, internal jokes that humanized the boss, and messages repeated again and again, always pointing in the same direction. Take care of the customer, watch costs, keep the stores clean, be proud of offering prices that helped families fill their carts, and above all, do not fall into the temptation of getting comfortable, because every day they relaxed was a day when someone, somewhere, could do it better and take away that bond with the community. As the chain spread across the South, distinctive traits began to appear that today are part of Walmart's identity. Internal expressions, ways of addressing employees, who were no longer seen as simple store workers but as partners in a project that aimed to grow far beyond what any of them imagined, and that idea translated into concrete details, such as Sam's insistence that managers and many key team members hold ownership in the company, buying shares and feeling that the success of the enterprise would directly impact their own future. In that environment, the first symbols of corporate culture were also forged, small gestures that over time would become almost legendary within the organization, like motivational chants, meetings where team morale was lifted with a mix of humor and discipline, or the anecdotes of Sam asking for unnecessary lights to be turned off or materials to be reused to save a few dollars, reminding everyone that frugality was not a slogan, it was a mindset that allowed prices to stay low without compromising the viability of the business. At the operational level, expansion required solving very concrete problems that could ruin the entire concept if not managed well, from coordinating inventory among several stores to planning openings so as not to saturate a single region. And there one could see Sam, the strategist, organizing expansion as a series of concentric circles around the distribution centers that were being established in strategic locations, avoiding leaving stores isolated and ensuring that the raw material of his model, the products sold on the shelves, could arrive quickly and economically. Despite the growth, the company still appeared to be an austere organization, with headquarters in Bentonville that looked more like an extension of a small-town store than the home of a rapidly expanding company, with no visible luxuries, with people working in functional spaces, with Sam moving through the hallways in a simple shirt and cap, making it very clear that no one there was supposed to show off. They were there to keep alive a network of stores that depended on every small decision in order to remain competitive in price. Outside, what people saw was the social impact of that strategy. Towns that had never had a large store suddenly had a Walmart as their commercial epicenter. People traveled from many kilometers around, parking lots filled up on weekends, families organized part of their routine around visits to the store, and although it represented fierce competition for traditional businesses, it also generated employment, activity, and the feeling that the town was being acknowledged by a company that was starting to appear repeatedly in regional conversations. Sam himself enjoyed being close to that reality. walking through stores unannounced, stopping in the clothing section, in hardware, in toys, talking to customers who often had no idea that the simple man with the farmer-like appearance was the founder of the chain, and mentally noting everything that caught his attention, from a cluttered aisle to a misplaced product, to a brilliant idea from a manager who had decided to reorganize a section to increase sales. During those years, the company began to experience something very similar to a contagion phenomenon, because a successful store made it easier to open another within a relatively close radius, not only for logistical reasons, but also due to the reputation spreading by word of mouth. Neighbors recommending the new store, trucks with the logo becoming increasingly common along the roads, and that sensation that a new type of player was emerging in Southern commerce, an organization that still looked like a regional business but already displayed ambitions and a structure far exceeding the size of a classic family enterprise. As the number of stores increased, the management complexity grew as well, and Sam understood that it was not enough to be a great shopkeeper. He had to learn to run an expanding company, surround himself with people capable of managing specific areas, trust managers, district supervisors, and administrative teams, while keeping alive that closeness to the ground level of the business that he valued so much, balancing his role as a visionary founder with that of a director who needed to make decisions from a higher vantage point. That balance between the road and the office, between the details of the shelf and large-scale planning, defined the last years of that first major expansion through the deep south of the United States, a stage in which Walmart multiplied in number of stores, consolidated its identity as a discount chain close to small-town customers, and started drawing attention from banks, analysts, and competitors who had underestimated for far too long the economic potential of those rural regions. And when the map already showed a dense network of interconnected stores, when the internal feeling was that they were in the middle of a wave of growth that could not be stopped, one idea became clear. To keep pushing the model to the next level, it would take more than intuition, a strong culture, and long days on the road. It would require taking a decisive step in the financial world and radically strengthening the logistical structure that supported that entire expanding network. Initial public offering, trucks and a brain made of satellites. At the beginning of the decade of 1970, when the map of the southern part of the United States was already beginning to fill with small blue dots bearing the name Walmart, and the internal feeling was that of being aboard a train that accelerated a little more every year, Sam Walton understood that he had reached a dangerous limit. The model worked, the stores grew, the customers responded, but the financial and logistical structure still had the body of a medium-sized company. And if he wanted to keep extending that network of discount stores without losing control of the operations, he needed something that, for him, a man of the countryside and the store, had never been personally exciting, but was essential for the next stage, opening the company to the capital market. The public offering was not for him a gesture of vanity, nor a trophy to hang on the wall. It was a cold and calculated move to obtain the fuel needed to ignite much larger engines, a way to transform the trust that the public was already placing in Walmart, in the form of loyal customers, into financial resources that would allow the company to accelerate the pace of store openings and, above all, to build the logistical backbone that would support everything during the following decades, something that at first glance might seem less glamorous than inaugurating new locations. But that for Sam was as thrilling as seeing a store full on a Saturday afternoon. By opening the door to investors, Walmart began to be observed differently. It stopped being a friendly regional phenomenon to become an actor that interested analysts, bankers, and specialized media, people who paid attention to sales growth, to margins, to geographical expansion, and who wondered how much real potential that model of large stores in small towns truly had. And Sam used that attention to reinforce one of the messages he most repeated to his executive team. The money that arrives is not meant to decorate offices, nor to inflate egos. It is meant to build better systems, to put more products in the right place, at the right price, and at the exact moment. With that spirit, the company began to invest aggressively in distribution centers, large warehouses strategically located that functioned as the logistical heart of several dozen stores, places where merchandise arrived in large volumes, was classified, and was redistributed quickly toward the Walmart stores of the region, reducing idle time, preventing trucks from traveling half-empty, and allowing store inventory to always remain as closely aligned as possible with real demand. a philosophy revolving around a simple but tremendously demanding operational concept: the product must not sleep in the warehouse. Around those distribution centers, another key decision of that era began to take shape: the construction of a private fleet of trucks, something that implied considerable investment and a change in mentality compared to many competitors who preferred to depend on external carriers, a practice Sam viewed with skepticism, because he felt he could not leave in the hands of third parties the control of something as critical as the daily flow of merchandise. And so Walmart began to fill the highways with its own trailers, recognizable, disciplined, moving according to a rhythm designed to fit like a finely tuned gear with the rest of the organization. That decision contained a very clear logic. By controlling the trucks, the company could set routes, schedules, and service standards designed specifically for the needs of the chain, could measure delivery times with precision, could adjust routes to save fuel, and could generate a logistical culture that was as much a part of Walmart as the cash registers or the signs announcing low prices every day. A culture where the driver of a trailer leaving at 4 in the morning formed part of the same purpose as the cashier who smiled at 8 to a customer paying for their weekly purchase. As the physical network grew more complex, with distribution centers connected by trucks that delivered merchandise with increasingly refined punctuality, a new challenge emerged that required a different way of thinking about the business: how to coordinate in near real time what was happening in dozens, and then hundreds, of stores dispersed across different states. How to know which items sold better, which ones ran out too quickly, which products became stuck on the shelves of one region but worked well in another. Questions that until then had been answered through phone calls, paper reports, and in-person meetings, tools far too slow for the pace Walmart was beginning to set. It was in that context that the company made a leap that placed it years ahead of much of its competition: the decision to build its own communications network based on satellite technology. Something that, for a business apparently so grounded as retail, sounded like science fiction. But Sam and his team interpreted it as the only way to keep the promise of low prices alive at an ever-increasing scale. Because to lower prices without losing financial control, it was essential to have precise, fast, and centralized information, and that required connecting each store's registers to a kind of shared brain. The installation of satellite dishes on the roofs of Walmart stores marked a symbolic moment in the company's history, because it visually revealed something few customers ever stopped to think about. That place where they bought detergent, clothing, or small appliances was directly connected to a nerve center capable of seeing, almost minute by minute, what was happening in the sales of each region, adjusting orders to suppliers, planning promotions, and detecting trends with an agility impossible in the old days of monthly reports sent by mail. Inside the headquarters, this new infrastructure changed the way people worked. Executives and operations teams began to receive data that previously took weeks to arrive, and that allowed them to experiment with concepts such as faster replenishment, adapting the product assortment of each area according to the real preferences of customers, and the early detection of inventory problems. While in the stores, managers began to feel that they were part of a broader nervous system, where their information fed decisions that affected the entire chain. In terms of business mindset, the shift from depending on papers and delayed presentations to having a constant flow of data through satellites was like going from driving at night with only parking lights to turning on powerful headlights that allowed them to see much farther. And that ability to anticipate customer behavior, to understand which categories pushed growth the most and which ones needed to be rethought, became a competitive advantage that did not appear in advertisements, but that explained in large measure why Walmart was able to keep lowering prices while keeping the business healthy. All this technical deployment, which might seem cold when seen purely from an engineering standpoint, had a profoundly down-to-earth purpose in Sam's mind, continuing to make viable that commitment to the families with tight budgets who filled the aisles of his stores, demonstrating that the intelligent use of technology and logistics was not an end in itself, but a means to compress costs and offer real savings in every shopping cart, something that, multiplied by millions of purchases per year, ultimately affected the daily lives of many people who found in Walmart a sort of silent ally in their monthly battle to reach the end without emptying their bank account. With the public offering financing part of the growth, the distribution centers functioning as enormous lungs, the trucks traveling the highways like red blood cells carrying merchandise to each store, and the satellites sending data that allowed the company to refine operations almost by the second, Walmart had definitively left behind the stage of being a regional chain that grew based on intuition and long hours on the road, entering a phase where scale and technology played in its favor, opening the door to new ideas about store formats, types of customers, and ways to capture a larger share of the spending of each family that walked through its doors. Sam's Club and the superstore that sells absolutely everything. At the beginning of the decade of 1980, when Walmart had already consolidated itself as an unstoppable force in the southern region and was advancing toward new areas with a well-oiled network of discount stores, Sam Walton began to look at the map of consumer behavior from a different perspective. He stopped focusing only on the families who filled their carts on weekends and started thinking about an actor he had relatively overlooked until that moment: the small business owner, the neighborhood restaurateur, the owner of a gas station, the person in charge of an independent store who needed to buy large quantities of products to resell them or to keep their own business running, people who made their purchases in bulk under disadvantageous conditions, with suppliers who imposed prices and deadlines. In that context, in the year 1983, the idea was born to create a different format, a warehouse even more stripped of adornments, with wide aisles, pallets in plain sight, gigantic packaging, and an atmosphere that resembled a loading zone more than a traditional store, a place where the key was not display but volume. Sam's Club, a membership club designed so that those who purchased in large quantities could obtain even more adjusted prices in exchange for paying an annual membership fee that, in his mental structure, made a great deal of sense because it turned those customers into members of a community with a mutual commitment. The business logic behind Sam's Club was elegant and simple. The club charged a fee that generated recurring income from the very first day, which made it possible to work with even slimmer margins on the products. The warehouse format reduced presentation and staffing costs enormously. The assortment was oriented toward large boxes and packages with many units, and the feeling for the customer was that of gaining access to a level of savings reserved for a smaller circle, something that reinforced the idea of belonging and pushed the member to take advantage of the membership by making purchases every so often so that this initial investment made sense in their mind. At the same time, Sam detected another key behavior in his traditional discount stores. He saw that customers came to buy clothing, home goods, toys, hardware items, and an endless number of categories, but that to fill the refrigerator they still went to the lifelong supermarket. So a huge portion of the recurrent spending of those families escaped every week toward other aisles, other carts, and other cash registers. And that continuous flow of money outside Walmart began to bother him deeply, because he understood that if he managed to integrate food effectively, the visit frequency would skyrocket and the relationship with the customer would become much more intense. The answer to that reasoning materialized in a word that, over time, would become familiar throughout almost all of the United States: supercenter, a format that began to be tested at the end of the decade of the 1980s, and that combined in the same building the typical Walmart discount store with a full supermarket, with fresh sections, frozen products, bakery, butcher, and all the necessary infrastructure for a family to make in a single place the week's large grocery purchase, the restocking of home items, and the acquisition of non-food products that before were purchased at separate moments. The difference for the customer was enormous, because the trip to the supermarket, which until then had been separated from the experience of entering a Walmart, became part of one single ritual. The car was parked in front of a building that contained absolutely everything, and the feeling of efficiency translated into time saved, into gasoline not spent visiting several stores, and, above all, into a perception of overall savings, when all the receipts were added together. And that was exactly what Sam had sought since his earliest days in Walton's 5 and 10, to become the place where money stretched further. Behind that integration was enormous operational complexity that the company took on by relying on the machinery it had built in the previous decade. The distribution centers, the fleet of trucks, the satellite-based information system, and all that structure that made it possible to coordinate the constant flow of products. Only now, it was no longer just about handling televisions, clothing, or detergent. It was necessary to manage perishable products, maintain cold chains, ensure much more frequent deliveries, and react quickly to demand changes that, in food, could be far more sensitive to the seasons, holidays, and local customs. The first supercenters were, in a certain sense, large-scale laboratories, spaces where Walmart tested its ability to be at the same time a discount hypermarket and a supermarket that competed with specialized food retailers. And in those experiments, every detail was refined, from the design of the customer's route, which had to guide them through strategic sections without making them feel manipulated, to the integration of private label products and local suppliers who helped give a sense of closeness to a store that, because of its dimensions, could feel overwhelming if not managed with sensitivity. While Sam's Club stores grew as a parallel network aimed at small business owners, large families, and consumers willing to buy in large volumes, the supercenters worked as giant traffic magnets, concentrating a large part of the commercial activity of an area, and that intensified Walmart's role in the daily life of the communities where they were installed, because the store stopped being a place visited sporadically for a specific purchase and became a weekly stop, almost an obligatory one, in the schedule of thousands of households. In strategic terms, Walmart was covering two fronts at the same time. On one hand, it captured an important portion of business and semi-business consumption with Sam's Club, relying on the idea of membership and volume, and on the other hand, it consolidated its dominance in recurrent family spending with the supercenters, increasing the portion of household budget that stayed inside its ecosystem, and all of that was built on the same cultural foundation as always. The obsession with minimizing costs, watching every dollar, and using the company's scale to negotiate with suppliers conditions that allowed it to maintain that pricing advantage without collapsing financially. Sam, already older and with deteriorated health, had time to witness the initial deployment of this offensive, to visit Sam's Club, to walk through supercenters, to observe with a certain satisfaction how that concept of a discount store that had been born in a small town in Arkansas transformed into a network of complementary formats, designed for different types of customers, but connected by the POSO's same essential promise, that a person would leave through the door with the feeling of having understood why it was worthwhile to go there and not to another place, of having made their money work better than in any alternative. The entry into food changed more than the aisles. It profoundly modified Walmart's relationship with time, because when a company sells televisions or furniture, the purchase frequency is relatively low. However, when it sells milk, bread, fruit, meat, pantry staples, it embeds itself in the most intimate routine of each household. It becomes part of daily life, and that almost automatic repetition of the visit makes the brand inscribe itself in people's memory with extraordinary strength, like a kind of invisible infrastructure of modern life, so every day that many stop seeing it and simply use it. For Sam's Club, the matter of time was also essential, because many of its members organized periodic visits to restock their businesses, and in each of those visits they left large amounts of money in boxes of products, taking full advantage of volume discounts. So the company became accustomed to managing two different rhythms, that of the daily or weekly purchase of the final consumer, and that of the concentrated and spaced purchase of those who supplied a small business, and learning to serve both rhythms without losing efficiency was one of the skills that consolidated Walmart as a versatile operator. From an entrepreneurial perspective, this stage shows a very interesting trait of the thinking of Sam and his management team. Once they mastered the initial discount store format, they did not freeze themselves in the winning formula. They dared to stretch it, to take it into other territories where the rules were more complex. Knowing that food had thinner margins but extremely high frequency, and that warehouse clubs required a different mentality, in which the customer was willing to pay the membership fee up front in exchange for price and access, something that required balancing expectations with reality in a very precise way. That combination of formats, that way of surrounding the customer from several angles, was preparing Walmart for a stage in which it would no longer be enough to simply open stores and watch them fill up, a stage where the company would have to manage the weight of being immense, confront growing criticism, reorganize its leadership after the passing of its founder, and decide to what extent it was willing to continue expanding in a world that was beginning to look at it with as much admiration as suspicion. Without Sam, inheritance, successors, and professionalization. In 1992, when Walmart had already become a gigantic network of stores covering a large part of the map of the United States, and the numbers were beginning to place it among the largest companies in the country, the figure of Sam Walton had long since become something more than that of a successful businessman. He was an internal symbol, a kind of patriarch who appeared in advertisements, in speeches to employees, and in newspaper articles with his eternal baseball cap, and yet his body no longer supported that myth with the same strength. The illness was advancing, and in Bentonville, there was a mixture of pride for what had been built and a silent concern for what would come next. In April of that year, Sam passed away, and the news traveled through the stores like a wave that crossed aisles, warehouses, break rooms, and offices, because many employees felt that it was not only a founder who was leaving, but the person who gave meaning to many of the small stories told in meetings, the origin of corporate habits that few dared to question. For a few days, the company seemed to hold its breath. There were flags at half-mast, emotional speeches, memories of that man who visited stores in a small aircraft and who insisted that Walmart's success was due to the people on the front line, serving customers and placing merchandise on the shelves. But the business world does not allow long pauses, and while tributes were being prepared and portraits were being printed that would hang for years on the walls of the stores, someone had to concentrate on a decisive question: how to move forward when the man who gave his name to the corporate culture was no longer there to repeat his messages in person, who would take the wheel of a structure that moved billions of dollars, employed hundreds of thousands of people, and competed in an increasingly tough environment, with rivals who no longer saw Walmart as a regional curiosity but as the opponent to beat. The formal answer to that question had been in preparation for some time, because Sam, despite his image as an instinctive merchant, had been pragmatic about succession, and the role of chief executive officer fell to David Glass, a low-profile man with an analytical mindset who had spent years inside the company and had gained the founder's trust precisely because of his ability to translate that very emotional culture into systems, processes, and structures more durable than the charisma of a single person. Therefore, at the moment of farewell, operational leadership was not improvised, but it was subjected to a definitive test. The Walton family maintained a strong presence as a shareholder and symbolic reference, but the day-to-day operations of the company passed into the hands of a professionalized management team, with Glass at the head, who understood that the challenge was not to invent a new Walmart but to prevent the company, with the passing of the years, from becoming something unrecognizable to those employees who had grown up under Sam's direct gaze. Thus, a conscious effort began to capture in writing what had previously been transmitted orally. The founder's rules were systematized. Anecdotes were compiled. Internal documents were elaborated that spoke of frugality, customer service, humility, and an obsession with costs, as if they were commandments of a kind of secular corporate religion. That process of professionalization did not mean immediate coldness, but it did bring with it a new layer of formality. Training programs for managers were reinforced. More sophisticated systems for evaluating performance were developed. Career paths were created so that an employee who began at a cash register could see a possible path toward positions of greater responsibility. And at the same time, the relationship with the financial world intensified, because Walmart was no longer only the creature of a founder. It was a publicly traded company that had to respond to analysts, investment funds, and millions of small shareholders, many of them employees of the company itself, who participated in stock purchase programs. The famous Saturday morning meetings, which Sam had turned into a ritual to review results, share stories of exceptional stores, and energize the week, continued under the new leaders, and in those crowded rooms one could clearly perceive the attempt to keep the original energy alive. Videos were shown. Examples of creativity in remote stores were shared. Phrases of the founder were repeated almost as if they were quotes from a reference book, while the management team presented growth charts, maps with new openings, and increasingly ambitious plans to enter states and regions where Walmart was not yet present. At the same time, the center of gravity of power gradually shifted from the unique figure of the founder to the Walmart system, understood as a combination of sharpened logistics, technology to manage inventory and sales data, an internal culture based on almost military enthusiasm, and an immense negotiating muscle with suppliers. That shift had an important consequence. The chain became less dependent on the personal style of whoever occupied the seat of chief executive officer, and more dependent on that person's ability to keep that machinery, which already functioned by inertia, tense and well lubricated, but which required constant vigilance to avoid drifting away from its purpose. During the 1990s, with Sam already transformed into a historical figure, Walmart accelerated its expansion beyond the south and the center of the country, entered the East Coast with force, advanced toward the west, multiplied the number of supercenters that combined the discount store format with a supermarket, boosted the growth of Sam's Club, and experimented with new locations that years earlier would have seemed too urban for its strategy. All of this occurred under a leadership that adopted a less protagonist, more collegiate style, relying on committees, strategic planning, and dashboards where performance was measured with almost obsessive precision. Professionalization could also be seen in the relationship with suppliers, which became more intense and more technical. Electronic data interchange systems were introduced that allowed manufacturers to know in almost real time how much of their products were being sold on Walmart's shelves. Periodic meetings were structured where the company clearly communicated its expectations regarding price, quality, and delivery times, and evaluation mechanisms were established that rewarded those who adapted to the company's philosophy and placed under pressure those who could not keep up with the pace. With time, this would fuel criticisms about the disproportionate power the chain exercised over a large part of the consumer goods industry. In Bentonville, despite the enormous growth and the constant appearance of Walmart on lists of the most valuable companies in the country, the aesthetics of the headquarters continued to be austere, which did not prevent the organization from developing layers of bureaucracy that were inevitable when a company reached such a size. There were more hierarchical levels, more formal processes for approving decisions, more specialization in each area, and this created tensions between the romantic vision of permanent entrepreneurship that Sam embodied and the reality of a corporation that had to manage risks, comply with increasing regulations, and maintain the stability of a gigantic structure. For many veteran employees, the 1990s had a bittersweet taste. On one hand, they felt proud to see how Walmart became synonymous with a major retailer in the United States, to see that what began with a store in Rogers had turned into a network that generated millions of daily transactions. On the other hand, they perceived that the distance between the upper management and the store floor grew a little larger each year, that the figure of the founder, who used to show up unexpectedly in any location, had been replaced by executives who, although committed, moved among tight schedules, constant flights, and result presentations. From the perspective of entrepreneurship, this moment in Walmart's history is especially interesting because it shows a turning point that many companies do not overcome. The transition from a founder-driven company to a system-driven corporation, from culture transmitted in person to values coded in manuals, from decisions taken in a notebook to strategies developed in boardrooms full of presentations. And yet, despite all those changes, the commercial essence continued to revolve around the same idea: offering the lowest possible prices to capture the largest share of everyday consumer spending, an obsession that acted as a guiding thread between the past and the present. As the new leadership settled and the company perfected its expansion model, Walmart's impact on American society became too large to go unnoticed. The employment numbers were impressive, but so was the number of small shops that failed to survive when a large store opened on the outskirts. Families appreciated the savings at the checkout, but voices emerged questioning working conditions, wage policies, and the way the company used its purchasing power to pressure suppliers. That tension between admiration and criticism became an inseparable part of the narrative in the following years. With Sam turned into a myth, with successors who consolidated the system, and with a professionalization that allowed the management of an ever larger machine, Walmart entered a stage in which its name, in the United States, began to provoke very different emotions depending on whom one asked, from the worker who had found stable employment there to the shopkeeper who had seen his store empty. That clash of perceptions would become precisely the terrain where reputation and legitimacy battles would be fought in the next phase of this story. The love and hate for Walmart at home. As the 1990s progress and the blue logo begins to appear in every corner of the map of the United States, the presence of Walmart becomes so everyday that it is difficult to remember what many cities were like before it arrived. The access roads fill with signs indicating the exit to the big store. The parking lots turn into improvised meeting points. And for millions of families, doing the shopping translates directly into going to Walmart because everything is there, from milk to the television, from the child's backpack to the car oil. And it is all available at prices that seem difficult to find elsewhere with that breadth of assortment. This bright side of the phenomenon, the side of the tangible savings seen on the receipt and felt at the end of the month, is what a significant part of the population mentions when asked about Walmart. Homemakers who organize their lists based on what they know is cheaper. Retirees who stretch their tight pensions thanks to the difference of a few dollars on each purchase. Large families who find in the chain a way to maintain a certain level of consumption without going bankrupt, and young people who enter for one specific thing and leave with a full cart because they have taken advantage of several bargains that, otherwise, they would not have been able to afford. But while those carts move through the perfectly lit aisles, in the main streets of many small towns a very different scene unfolds. There the metal shutters slowly descend over small hardware stores, independent clothing shops, neighborhood businesses that for decades had been the heart of local commerce and that now struggle against an implacable reality. They cannot compete with the prices of a giant that purchases on a national scale, that negotiates aggressively with suppliers, and that also concentrates traffic in a single point, diverting customers from the town center to a commercial area on the outskirts. In those towns that reorganize themselves around the big store, the conversation divides between those who celebrate that they finally have access to products and prices that they previously found only in the nearest big city, and those who look with nostalgia at the empty shop windows on the main street, remembering when the owner of each store was known by name, when shopping was also an excuse to chat with neighbors, and they feel that this way of life dissolves in an anonymous parking lot in front of an enormous building where the relationship with the company is almost always functional, quick, and without memory, a transaction in which the price rules above any other bond. At the same time, in the back room of the system, the relationship between Walmart and its suppliers becomes an increasingly discussed topic in the business world because the company uses its size as an extraordinarily powerful negotiating lever, setting demands on price, deadlines, and quality that many medium-sized companies struggle to meet, and those who accept the conditions find themselves forced to adjust their internal structures drastically, cutting costs, relocating production, or reducing profit margins, which fuels an intense debate about the extent to which the obsession with the lowest price at the checkout is linked to pressure throughout the entire supply chain. In parallel, the philosophy of everyday low prices begins to echo unexpectedly in another dimension of the public conversation, that of wages and working conditions within Walmart itself, because as the company becomes one of the largest employers in the country, labor movements, social organizations, and journalists investigate and bring to light stories of unpredictable schedules, wages close to the legal minimum, lack of adequate health coverage at certain times, and difficulties reconciling family life with rotating shifts that make the job feel like a tightrope on which many employees try to maintain their balance. In the media and in reports by critical organizations, a forceful narrative is constructed, one that presents the retail giant as an unstoppable machine, willing to sacrifice the well-being of communities and workers in the name of a model based on extreme savings, and that narrative strikes hard at the company's reputation, which sees its name increasingly associated with terms such as de facto monopoly, labor exploitation, or destruction of local commerce, expressions that cause damage in a context in which public opinion begins to pay attention to the social responsibility of companies. Inside Walmart, however, the image conveyed internally is very different. Executives and many veteran employees see themselves as part of a project that has created hundreds of thousands of jobs, that has allowed people from humble backgrounds to rise within the company, that has offered opportunities in areas where few large companies dare to establish themselves, and that has made millions of families save considerable amounts of money throughout their lives, something compared to a kind of indirect pay raise for those with fewer resources, which makes the clash between perceptions increasingly sharp. Faced with this crossfire, the company begins to deploy different response strategies. It launches communication campaigns that show stories of employees who have progressed, of internal training programs, of promotions from entry-level positions to roles of responsibility. It emphasizes community donation initiatives, support for schools, hospitals, and local projects, and it begins to incorporate into its discourse words that, until that moment, had been more present in the world of non-profit organizations than in that of discount retail: sustainability, social impact, commitment to the community. Gradually, and partly pushed by social and political pressure, Walmart introduces changes in its human resources policy. announces increases to its internal minimum wage in different stages, improves certain benefits, commits to reviewing controversial practices such as extremely variable schedules and rigid disciplinary mechanisms, and tries to present these changes as an evolution consistent with its original mission of helping working families. Although many critical organizations consider these steps slow and believe they respond more to the need to protect the brand than to a deep conviction. Meanwhile, in the communities affected by the arrival of new supercenters, the debate continues. There are mayors who celebrate the opening of a store because it implies direct employment, tax revenue, and a certain visibility for the municipality. And there are merchants' associations that denounce the loss of commercial diversity and the growing dependence on a single company for basic supply, with the risk that this poses if one day conditions change or the store decides to close for strategic reasons, a delicate balance that turns Walmart into an involuntary protagonist of discussions about the kind of cities and towns society wants to build. In the political sphere, the company becomes an object of attention and criticism in electoral campaigns. Some candidates use its name as an example of the excesses of contemporary capitalism. Others point to it as proof of the capacity of the United States to generate gigantic companies that provide massive employment and reduce living costs, and Walmart itself intensifies its presence in Washington and in state governments, expanding institutional relations teams, participating in regulatory debates, and seeking to influence rules that may affect its business model, something that exposes it even more to the scrutiny of those who distrust the relationship between large corporations and political power. The result of all these opposing forces is a climate of simultaneous love and rejection that accompanies the brand at every step in its country of origin. Millions of people choose it daily for their shopping and value what it offers, while another part of society looks at it with suspicion or even open hostility, considering it responsible for part of the inequalities and tensions of the modern labor market. And this duality becomes so deeply rooted in the American narrative that the name Walmart ceases to be merely a company and becomes a symbol onto which fears, hopes, economic arguments, and moral debates are projected. In this context, so charged with emotions and figures, the company's executives, already accustomed to managing the weight of the giant within the United States, begin to look outward with ambition towards other countries where they believe the model of low prices, sharp logistics, and large stores may find fertile ground, and they prepare for a stage in which the expansion map will no longer be limited to new roads within the same country, but will begin to cross borders, facing cultures, regulations, and consumption habits very different from those they had learned to master at home. Conquering the world and stumbling outside. In the middle of the decade of 1990, when the map of the United States was already practically covered with stores of the company, and the sales figures placed Walmart at the top of the country's retail industry, the question that began to circulate in Bentonville was obvious. If the model of aggressive pricing, refined logistics, and giant stores had worked so well at home, to what extent could it be transferred to other markets, to other cultures, to countries where shopping habits, labor regulations, and competition played by different rules, and where the name Walmart meant nothing to most of the population? The first major international laboratory was Mexico, a logical step due to geographical proximity and the intense economic relationship between both countries. But also a challenge, because the Mexican consumer had his own habits, his particular way of doing the weekly shopping, his preferred brands, and an enormous sensitivity to price mixed with a strong social component in the shopping experience. Walmart entered through an alliance with the Cifra Group, and little by little began integrating formats, introducing its operational culture, adapting assortments, and learning that, although the logistics structure resembled that of the United States, the store had to speak the everyday language of those who visited it, from the background music to the selection of fresh products. In Mexico, the bet ended up paying off decisively. Over time, Walmart of Mexico and Central America became one of the most important assets of the group worldwide. A giant within the giant, with different formats adapted to various income levels and different consumption moments, from hypermarkets to smaller stores oriented toward frequent purchases, and this success reinforced the idea that the Bentonville model could work beyond the border, as long as there was a willingness to adjust certain parts without betraying the core of the business, which remained moving large volumes with contained margins. Encouraged by that experience, the company moved north with determination, acquiring the locations of the Woolco chain in Canada and gradually transforming them into Walmart, entering a market with a consumption culture quite close to that of the United States, but with its own particularities in matters of regulation and competition. There, the landing was less traumatic than in other countries, partly because the customer was accustomed to large stores and international chains, and partly because the adaptation of the assortment and the communication was quick enough to avoid a massive rejection, so Canada consolidated with relative naturalness as a logical extension of the original empire. The truly bold move came when Walmart set its sights on Europe and decided to enter the United Kingdom by purchasing Asda at the end of the decade of the 1990s, acquiring an already consolidated chain with a strong presence in the low-price segment. Far from imposing a radical change from the first day, the strategy was more hybrid, attempting to combine Asda's local knowledge with the logistical and technological tools of Bentonville, and although the British market was highly competitive and full of demanding customers, the operation was not initially perceived as a failure, but rather as a complex field in which it was necessary to fight for market share centimeter by centimeter. Where the story changes tone is in Germany, a country with high purchasing power and a strong tradition of very aggressive discount chains, such as Aldi or Lidl, which had spent decades training the consumer to expect low prices packaged in ultra-efficient, almost Spartan formats. Walmart arrived buying existing chains and rebranding stores, but found itself facing a deep cultural clash. Customer service policies that worked wonderfully in Arkansas, such as having employees greet shoppers enthusiastically or prohibiting certain union dynamics, felt strange or directly irritated German consumers and clashed with a very protective labor legislation. In that context, the company became trapped between the rigidity of a regulatory framework that limited some of its usual practices, a local competition that understood the German customer better, and a corporate culture that took too long to admit that it was not enough to replicate the United States model on European soil. After years of losses, friction with works, councils, and bad press, Walmart ended up withdrawing from the German market, selling its stores and accepting that the experiment had generated more learning than profit. A hard lesson on the importance of humility when entering foreign territories. Something similar, although on another scale, occurred in South Korea, where the chain also decided to try its luck and encountered a dense urban environment, a consumer very demanding in terms of quality and service, and a deeply rooted local competition. The formats, the communication, and even the way of understanding daily convenience did not fully match the expectations of the market, and the company ended up leaving the country after acknowledging that its rivals had a finer harmony with the preferences of the Korean customer, which closed another chapter in the list of international attempts that did not reach the expected profitability. However, while Germany and South Korea became examples of international stumbles, Walmart continued expanding in other regions with more balanced results, increasing its presence in Latin America through operations in Brazil, Chile, and Central America, experimenting with hypermarket formats and proximity stores, and entering Asia through alliances and participations in companies in India and China, where the market potential was as large as the difficulties of navigating regulations, local competition, and cultural complexities that required a strategic finesse far greater than what was needed to open a new store in any state of the United States. In all these movements, a revealing pattern repeated itself. When the company was able to listen to the local market, give space to partners with deep knowledge of the terrain, and adjust key aspects of the assortment, the shopping experience, and the relationship with suppliers, the model of adjusted prices combined with powerful logistics found its place. In contrast, when the bet was based on imposing without nuance the processes of Arkansas onto contexts with very different traditions, the clash between Walmart's identity and the expectations of the consumer ended up taking its toll. For the management team, international expansion was a delicate balance between the ambition to take the Bentonville engine to the world and the need to preserve global profitability, because each failure in a country implied substantial losses, reputational damage, and a distraction of resources that could have been dedicated to consolidating more promising markets. At the same time, success in places like Mexico reinforced the belief that it was worth continuing to try, that the world offered too many growth opportunities to settle for the status of domestic champion. While the flags of different countries were added to the earnings presentations, and executives spoke of a global platform, parallel to that, there began to emerge less pleasant stories linked to that expansion. Investigations into the way the company interacted with local authorities, suspicions of questionable practices in some markets, and new labor and legal conflicts that were no longer limited to United States territory, but extended across different geographies, so that, at the same time Walmart was learning to move on the International Board of Retail, it also began to be forced to respond to an increasingly severe scrutiny about how it managed to open doors, obtain licenses, and sustain its margins in very diverse environments. Lawsuits, scandals, and a reputation in flames. Beginning in the late 1990s and continuing through the first years of the new century, while sales kept growing, stores multiplied, and quarterly reports displayed figures that made Wall Street analysts happy. A denser and denser cloud of legal conflicts, investigations, and journalistic reports began to form around Walmart, placing the spotlight on what the company preferred to keep in the background. The fine print of its labor model, its relationship with labor unions, the way it managed working hours, breaks, promotions, and, in general, the lives of the people who sustained the business from the base of the pyramid. In many states across the United States, collective lawsuits began to appear from employees who accused the company of forcing them, directly or indirectly, to work outside registered hours, to stay after closing time to finish tasks without that time appearing on their paychecks, or to work during breaks that, on paper, were supposed to be guaranteed. The testimonies describe scenes of managers pressured to meet impossible productivity targets, who in turn passed that pressure down to supervisors and cashiers, creating a chain of informal decisions that resulted in practices that violated labor laws, and that, once exposed in court, placed the company under a very uncomfortable light. In parallel, a massive gender discrimination lawsuit gained strength, accusing Walmart of maintaining a systematic glass ceiling for women, both in terms of promotions to positions of responsibility and in relation to salaries compared with male colleagues performing similar functions. It was not an isolated complaint from a small group. It was an action that came to represent hundreds of thousands of female employees and that placed the company at the center of the national debate about equality in the workplace, forcing its executives to defend themselves before judges, the media, and public opinion, arguing that promotion decisions were made in the stores, case by case, and did not obey any discriminatory corporate policy. Although in some judicial fronts Walmart won important procedural victories, including rulings that limited the scope of certain class actions, the reputational damage was already done, and the headlines that spoke of the largest workplace discrimination lawsuit in history, or of thousands of workers claiming unpaid wages, sank deeply into public perception, especially at a time when the cost of living was rising and economic inequalities were increasingly visible, so that even when a judge partially dismissed a case, the social narrative had already begun to consolidate around the image of a giant willing to squeeze its labor force in order to uphold its promise of low prices. Another line of conflict was related to the fiercely anti-union stance the company had displayed for decades, a posture that translated into internal manuals on how to detect any attempt at collective organization, training programs where the presence of unions was presented as a threat to flexibility and employment, and episodes as striking as the closure of an entire store in Canada shortly after workers voted in favor of unionizing, a coincidence interpreted by many as a clear message both internally and externally. At Walmart, the conversation about labor rights was conducted on the company's terms, not at a negotiation table with independent representatives. As human rights organizations and international labor unions began documenting these practices with more rigor, reports emerged describing a mix of union-busting strategies, fear campaigns, selective dismissals, and disciplinary measures for those seen as potential leaders of internal movements. And although the company responded with statements defending its right to explain the consequences of unionization and its commitment to offering direct communication channels between employees and management, in the media arena, those explanations competed with very concrete testimonies from workers who claimed to have suffered reprisals for organizing. At the same time, the globalization of the business brought with it another type of risk that was not limited to the walls of the stores, but involved the way Walmart interacted with governments and authorities in different countries. One of the most delicate episodes erupted when journalistic investigations indicated that, in Mexico, the company's local subsidiary might have resorted to bribes to speed up construction permits and urban development licenses, weaving a network of illegal payments to officials with the goal of gaining time in store openings and gaining advantage over potential competitors, a behavior that, if confirmed, would represent serious violations of anti-corruption laws in the United States and abroad. The corporate reaction to those accusations was a mixture of promises to collaborate with authorities, the opening of internal investigations, and the strengthening of compliance policies, with new codes of conduct, increased controls over international operations, and strong messages about zero tolerance toward any practice contrary to business ethics. However, the public narrative once again placed Walmart at the center of a moral conflict, because the idea that a company that presented itself as a friend of the communities could at the same time be corrupting public processes to impose its presence in certain neighborhoods was especially irritating for those who already saw it as an excessively powerful actor. In that climate, the chain became a recurring target of activist campaigns that went far beyond judicial lawsuits, with boycotts organized, protests held in front of new store openings, documentaries analyzing its impact on local economies, books addressing its role in the transformation of retail labor. And each of those efforts fed a critical narrative that had an almost educational component. Using the Walmart case to illustrate, for the general public, the effects of a model based on the accumulation of purchasing power and on the homogenization of the consumer experience. Within the company, the blow from these episodes was felt both in external communication and in internal hallways, where human resources and legal compliance leaders began to have a much more visible role in the structure. Training programs on ethics were organized, hiring procedures were reviewed, anonymous reporting channels for employees were reinforced, and initiatives were launched to present Walmart as an increasingly inclusive place, with efforts to increase the presence of women and minorities in leadership roles and to improve health and education benefits for the workforce. At the same time, the corporation tried to balance the scales by showing its philanthropic side more intensely, increasing donations from the foundation linked to the Walton family, supporting food banks, educational projects, disaster relief programs, and other initiatives that, although in many cases had a sincere component, were also perceived as part of a strategy to counteract the reputational erosion accumulated after years of conflict. In advertisements and statements, the company spoke of giving back to the communities, a part of what they had given, while critics insisted that the best way to contribute would be to raise wages, reduce precariousness, and strengthen negotiation with the people working in the stores. The result of that period was a kind of unstable tie in the arena of public opinion, with people who continued to see Walmart as the everyday hero that allowed customers to buy cheaply and gave employment to millions, and people who perceived it as the extreme symbol of the imbalances of modern capitalism, capable of squeezing costs to the limit, pressuring local governments, and turning into a norm a labor relationship based on low wages and schedules difficult to reconcile with personal life. A clash of narratives that remained alive because both contained a portion of truth depending on the vantage point. While the lawyers kept working in boardrooms and courtrooms, while communication teams refined messages and compliance officers reviewed protocols country by country, a much quieter but equally profound transformation was taking shape in parallel. The change in consumer purchasing habits, the arrival of the internet as a massive sales channel, and the appearance of a new competitor that, within just a few years, would no longer look like an online bookstore but would become the most serious threat Walmart had faced since its beginnings, forcing the giant of physical aisles to rethink its model in a world that was beginning to move increasingly behind a screen. The digital awakening. Amazon enters the ring. In the late 1990s and the early 2000s, while Walmart continued opening supercenters, fine-tuning its logistics, and fighting legal and reputational battles, a change was beginning to take shape far from Bentonville that, at first, the company looked at with a certain distance, almost as a technological curiosity, a new channel that seemed destined for people with a computer at home, noisy connections, and the patience to wait several days for a package to arrive by mail. That change was electronic commerce, and the name that was starting to be heard with increasing force was that of a company that had been born selling books on the internet and that, little by little, dared to enter almost any category: Amazon. For a time, a mindset deeply tied to its own history of success prevailed within Walmart. The idea that the key to dominating the market lay in having the best physical locations, the most optimized stores, the lowest transportation costs, and that customers would continue to get into their cars to fill their carts every week because the experience of seeing and touching products, of walking the aisles, of taking advantage of in-person deals was part of the consumption habit of millions of families. So Amazon's growth was interpreted more as a threat to bookstores, specialty shops, and less efficient retailers than as a direct danger to the very heart of the Walmart model. However, the internet began to change scale. Connections became faster. Electronic commerce stopped being a curiosity for technophiles and turned into a real alternative for millions of people. And Amazon took advantage of every inch of that ground, expanded its catalog in an almost obsessive way, invested in distribution centers designed for rapid packing, perfected its recommendation algorithms, and above all launched a program that would change the psychology of online shopping, an annual membership that offered fast shipping and, over time, a whole series of added benefits. A proposal that bound the customer emotionally and economically to that platform. Meanwhile, in Bentonville, the company was making its first experiments with digital presence, web pages that functioned almost like extended shop windows, an electronic commerce offering that, relative to its size, was timid, without the aggressiveness it had shown in the physical arena, with still imperfect integrations between store inventory and the online catalog, and with an internal culture that continued to think of the store as the center of the universe, so that, even though there were teams pushing digital transformation, the symbolic and real weight of the organization remained concentrated in brick, concrete, and brightly lit aisles. The passage of time began to correct that perception through facts. Market reports showed how Amazon was eating up growing shares in key categories. Consumer discourse changed. Price comparison was done from the mobile phone screen rather than from a paper flyer, and the young adults entering the labor market no longer carried in their memory the epic of the great supercenter openings, but rather the ease of clicking from the couch and receiving almost any product the next day without setting foot in a store, something that forced Walmart to look itself in the mirror and recognize that its dominance in the physical world did not guarantee victory in the new digital field. The real awakening came when online growth figures stopped being a niche issue and became a direct threat to leadership in total sales, and executives understood that the gigantic size of the company could turn into a disadvantage if inertia prevented rapid movement. That recognition of vulnerability gave way to a stage of much bolder decisions in the digital arena, and the clearest signal of that change was the acquisition of Jet.com in 2016, an electronic commerce startup that had tried to compete with Amazon with an aggressive pricing proposal and technology designed to optimize every order. The acquisition of Jet.com was interpreted by many as an implicit confession that Walmart was late to the online game, but also as a demonstration that it was willing to pay dearly to catch up, because the deal did not only incorporate a technological platform, it incorporated talent, led by Mark Lohr, an entrepreneur with experience in electronic commerce, who went on to occupy a key role in the company's digital strategy, driving deep changes in the way the online store, the third-party marketplace, and the integration between the website and physical locations were understood. Under this new leadership, Walmart.com began to transform in a visible way. It stopped being a half-forgotten add-on and became a strategic project. The catalog was expanded with products from external sellers, the design and usability of the site were improved, work was done on more competitive delivery times, and above all, the company began to take advantage of an edge that Amazon did not have to the same extent: the massive presence of physical stores spread across the country, which could function as small logistical centers, nodes close to the customer from which to prepare orders for pickup or rapid delivery. This turned toward an omni-channel model, in which the boundary between buying online and buying in store became blurred, took concrete form in services such as buy online and pick up in store or parking lot pickup, which allowed customers to place an order from their mobile phone or computer and stop by to collect it at a specific time without having to walk the aisles. A solution that connected the tradition of going to the neighborhood Walmart with digital convenience, and that intelligently exploited that unique combination of physical infrastructure and consumption data the company had accumulated over decades. At the same time, the chain intensified its bet on online groceries, first with programs for picking up supermarket orders prepared by employees and loaded into the customer's trunk, and later with home deliveries in certain areas, thus competing in a field that for years had seemed difficult to conquer through the internet, that of fresh products and basic pantry items that had historically forced customers to set foot in a store. Here again, the store network played as a tactical advantage because being close to neighborhoods allowed orders to be prepared without relying exclusively on large peripheral warehouses. In parallel with these operational innovations, Walmart was forced to enter the online price war more directly, matching offers, launching web-specific promotions, and using its purchasing power to negotiate conditions that allowed it to compete cent by cent with Amazon on key products, which turned each product page into a kind of micro-battle in which the algorithms of both companies watched the other's price and adjusted their own with a speed that would have been unimaginable in the era of printed flyers. From an internal perspective, the digitalization process brought with it a change in the profile of part of the talent joining the company. Engineers, data scientists, user experience designers, and digital product specialists began to arrive. People who had little to do with the classic figure of the store manager trained on the floor, and who started to occupy influential positions in defining the company's future, bringing to Bentonville debates that until then had seemed typical of Silicon Valley. Platform architecture, A/B testing, data-driven personalization, artificial intelligence applied to product recommendation. That mix of traditional retail culture and technological mindset generated tensions and learning in both directions. Newcomers had to understand the complexity of moving physical merchandise across hundreds of stores with very diverse customer profiles, and veterans of the physical world had to accept that. Although the aisle would remain important for many years, there was a new, invisible aisle on screens where a growing part of the game was being played, and that ignoring that space was equivalent to ceding strategic ground to a competitor that kept growing. On the street, customers began to perceive Walmart as something more than the big store of always. The shopping experience extended to the mobile application. Features appeared to scan products while walking through the store. Fast payment options, personalized digital coupons, and pilot programs that used behavioral data to suggest specific products, gradually building a sense of ecosystem in which the brand accompanied the user from the couch to the checkout, passing through the parking lot, and, eventually, through the screen of a connected television. All this effort did not eliminate the threat of Amazon, which continued to grow and diversify into cloud computing, devices, and digital content, but it did prevent Walmart from being relegated to the role of an outdated giant trapped in brick and mortar. It forced it to think with a platform mindset and prepared it for a phase in which the battle for the customer would no longer be fought solely in terms of price and assortment, but in the ability to build long-term relationships through loyalty programs, added services, and continuous value propositions that made consumers feel that, more than a store, they had a commercial home to return to again and again. Memberships, data, and the Walmart Plus ecosystem. When the calendar reaches the year 2020 and the entire world begins living in a constant state of lockdowns, masks, and mobility restrictions, Walmart finds itself facing a paradoxical situation. On the one hand, its physical stores are considered essential services and become critical supply points for millions of people. On the other hand, the brutal acceleration of electronic commerce and the sudden dependence on home deliveries make it even clearer that the battle for customer loyalty will not be decided solely on the store shelf. It will be decided by the ability to build a recurring, deep, and service-based relationship. And this is where an idea that had been taking shape in Bentonville for some time suddenly gains new urgency, creating a membership in the style of what Amazon had achieved with Prime, but supported by the dual pillars of physical stores and the digital channel. This is how Walmart Plus is born, a membership launched in 2020 as a kind of master key that gives access to an ecosystem of benefits, combining the online world and the offline world, a proposal that does not simply say, "I will send your packages faster," but instead attempts to connect with the customer's daily routine by offering free deliveries of groceries and general catalog products above a certain minimum, discounts on gasoline at partner stations, the ability to use the mobile phone to scan products inside the store and pay without passing through a traditional checkout, and a set of small privileges that turn the relationship with the brand into something more stable than a simple one-time purchase. The logic behind this membership is very clear from a business perspective. Charging a recurring, relatively accessible fee that generates stable income for the company, and in exchange offering advantages that make the customer concentrate more and more of their spending inside the Walmart universe. Because once someone pays for a subscription, their psychology changes. They begin to think about taking advantage of it, about recovering that investment, about checking first what the service they have already paid for offers before seeking alternatives, which translates into more visits, more digital orders, and a greater willingness to try additional services integrated into that value proposition. On the operational level, launching Walmart Plus requires careful coordination among the different parts of the machine. The physical stores must adapt their processes for pickup and deliveries. The digital platforms must accurately register which benefits correspond to each type of subscriber. The gas stations must synchronize their systems to apply discounts smoothly. And the technology department must ensure that the mobile application, which becomes the remote control for the experience, works with the reliability and speed customers expect when they have entrusted their credit card to the service. At the same time, the company begins to see itself as something closer to an ecosystem than to a simple chain of stores. It realizes that every interaction with a customer generates valuable data, from the purchase history to preferred times of day, to the categories that attract the most interest. And all that information, well managed and respecting privacy regulations, can be used to personalize offers, optimize inventories, design tailor-made promotions, and, in general, make each person's experience feel less generic and more aligned with their real consumption habits. With Walmart Plus, this ability to understand the customer becomes even sharper because the membership concentrates more types of interaction in a single profile. Online purchases, in-store visits with scanning from the mobile phone, fuel refills, the use of digital coupons. All of this allows the construction of a kind of X-ray of the daily life of each household in the program. And that X-ray is immensely useful both to decide which products to push and to strengthen a new line of business that, over time, becomes one of the silent pillars of many large retailers: the sale of advertising and privileged space within the platform itself, where brands pay to appear in better positions in front of those customers most likely to buy. As the years pass, Walmart Plus begins to mature, and the company understands that if it wants the membership to be more than a logistical package with discounts, it must expand into territories that connect with leisure and free time. Because anyone competing with Amazon knows that they are not up against a mere product seller. They are up against a subscription that includes series, movies, music, and an entire galaxy of content that accompanies the user on their sofa, during their commutes, and in their idle moments. That is why Walmart decides to partner with entertainment platforms and start offering access to streaming services as part of the package, so that the monthly or annual fee does not feel like an expense tied only to shopping, but rather like a gateway to hours of entertainment. This move strengthens a trend that was already emerging in the sector: the trend of transforming the retailer-customer relationship into something similar to a platform-subscriber relationship, where the physical product, the box of cereal, or the television, becomes part of a broader experience in which the user feels that, in exchange for a periodic payment, they receive a blend of logistics, savings, convenience, and entertainment. And the choice of one provider over another begins to depend on who offers the most attractive combination of benefits rather than the isolated price of a specific item. Something that forces Walmart to think like a service company, not only like a machine for distributing merchandise. Beneath this visible layer of advantages, what is reinforced with Walmart Plus is the strategy of deep loyalty. The company wants its members to feel that they have a kind of preferred lane on the highway of everyday consumption. That ordering groceries from the app, filling the tank at a discount, accessing a piece of streaming content, or taking advantage of an exclusive promotion all form part of a single narrative in which Walmart positions itself as a stable partner in daily life, the place one turns to both when it is time to fill the pantry and when one wants to save on gasoline or watch a series at night. From an entrepreneurial perspective, the creation of Walmart Plus and its evolution reveal a major shift in the company's mindset. It moves from thinking in terms of one-time transactions to thinking in terms of long-term relationships supported by information, recurring services, and the feeling of belonging to a circle with advantages. And it uses the membership as a kind of glue to unite pieces that previously seemed scattered. Physical stores, electronic commerce, advertising, last-mile logistics, partnerships with third parties and data, vast amounts of data, which feed recommendation systems. demand prediction models, and strategic decisions about where to invest the next dollar of capital. Of course, this transformation is not without challenges, because turning millions of customers into subscribers requires keeping the service at the level of their expectations, managing demand spikes without collapsing, protecting the privacy of the information collected, communicating clearly what is and is not offered, and at the same time continuing to compete fiercely on price with rivals who do not stand still. However, for Walmart, the path of memberships and the integrated ecosystem is perceived internally as an inevitable evolution in a world where the consumer is increasingly surrounded by platforms that try to capture their attention and their spending continuously. As Walmart Plus continues adding features and smoothing its edges, as the company explores new ways to connect light financial services, insurance, health, or even travel experiences with its universe of low prices and high frequency of use, it becomes clear that the future of the giant from Bentonville will not rest solely on its ability to fill shelves, but on its ability to weave a network of services and data around the customer, a network so present in daily life that switching providers feels more than a simple purchasing decision, like a small earthquake in the organization of everyday life. Robots, drones, and intelligent stores. In the second half of the decade of 2010, when Walmart had already become accustomed to thinking of itself as a mixture of store chain, digital platform, and membership program, a silent shift began to take shape in the way it operated. It was a shift that appeared less in television advertisements and much more in the back corridors, in the ceilings of distribution centers, and in the depths of its computer systems, a shift that had to do with no longer relying solely on trucks, carts, and employees moving boxes, and with beginning to lean on an army of machines that worked without rest, from robots that organized pallets at high speeds to algorithms that decided what to send to each store even before the customer thought about going to buy. The classic image of a Walmart distribution center, with mountains of boxes, employees on forklifts, and a constant noise of engines, began to transform little by little with the arrival of automated storage and sorting systems, solutions developed alongside technological partners such as Symbotic. These systems allowed robots to move through enormous structures of metal shelves, pick products with precision, and place them in containers, ready to be sent to the stores, all following instructions generated by software that calculated routes, times, and priorities with a precision unreachable for any manual planning. And it did so 24 hours a day, constantly adjusting the flow based on real sales. This automation rollout in distribution centers was not a futuristic whim designed to generate headlines. It responded to a very specific need. The low-price model depends on merchandise moving with extreme efficiency, on there being no corridors full of pallets waiting days to be relocated, on trucks leaving as fully loaded as possible, and on errors in order preparation being reduced to the minimum expression. And in a world where electronic commerce adds hundreds of thousands of more fragmented orders to the equation, machines become an almost mandatory ally to maintain the pace without driving labor costs upward or overwhelming the human staff. While the robots took care of that backstage choreography of boxes, in the part visible to customers, signs of that automated future also began to appear. First came the robots that moved through store aisles to inspect inventory levels, detect empty shelves, check prices, and scan barcodes at a speed that would have been impossible for an employee with a handheld device. Then came the autonomous cleaning machines that slid across the supermarket floor, adjusting their path so as not to bother customers. And although at first they generated some strangeness, they gradually became part of the daily landscape of the store, a discreet reminder that the world of retail was no longer an exclusively human affair. At the same time, Walmart began to experiment with an idea that seemed taken from a science fiction film, but that responded to a very concrete problem of the 21st century: how to deliver products quickly, cheaply, and efficiently in suburban and semi-rural areas, where placing a huge fleet of delivery drivers might not be profitable. The answer was the use of drones for delivery, small unmanned aerial vehicles capable of transporting light packages from an origin point to the garden of a house in a matter of minutes, coordinated by digital platforms that planned routes, controlled altitude, and ensured that each flight complied with air safety regulations. The first pilot programs were limited to a few areas, with special permits and a reduced list of products suitable for that type of delivery. But over time they grew in ambition, covering entire regions and offering customers the possibility of receiving over-the-counter medicines, prepared food, small supermarket orders, and other everyday items in such a short time window that, for practical purposes, it turned the sky into one more extension of the logistical system, a sort of invisible highway added to the roads traveled by trucks and vans. This did not mean that drones would replace traditional delivery overnight, because their load capacity and technical limitations kept them in a specific niche. But Walmart's push to expand them to large metropolitan areas, such as the Dallas-Fort Worth region, sent a clear message to the market. The giant of Bentonville was not willing to let others define the future of the last mile. It wanted to experiment, make mistakes, learn, and, if possible, turn that technology into a stable component of its promise of extreme convenience for the customer. Parallel to the physical robots and the drones, another layer of automation was being deployed, less visible and perhaps more decisive: the software that made decisions. These were artificial intelligence systems trained with decades of data on sales, inventories, climate patterns, seasons, festivities, and price changes, capable of predicting with remarkable precision how many units of a product should be sent to each store at a given moment, which assortment would work best in a specific neighborhood, how to adjust promotions in order not to run out of stock, nor flood warehouses with excess, and which combinations of products were most likely to end up together in the cart, both physical and digital. In this field, there also appeared the figure of internal and external conversational assistants, artificial intelligence tools that Walmart gave friendly names, such as Sparky, and that could interact with employees to help them find information about products, procedures, and schedules, or with customers to help them navigate the application, suggest options based on what they had previously purchased, and resolve basic questions about their order. In this way, the company began to use the same technologies that give life to large language models in a very specific context, facilitating daily operations and improving the shopping experience without increasing the number of people and manual attention. Inside the stores, digitalization advanced on other fronts that seemed small but had a significant impact on costs and agility. There were electronic labels that allowed prices to be changed on hundreds of shelves remotely, without depending on an employee to attach new stickers one by one, camera and sensor systems to better understand the flow of people, which aisles became congested, which areas were deserted, how customers behaved when there was a promotional island, and control panels in the back room where the manager could see, almost in real time, the pulse of the store, from the line at the registers to the pace at which certain products were running out. All this network of hardware and software transformed the role of human staff in Walmart. The most repetitive and heavy tasks, such as moving pallets for hours or scanning inventory manually, began to be handled by machines, and employees increasingly found themselves oriented towards tasks involving supervision, customer service, problem-solving, and operations that required judgment and flexibility. It was a transition not free of concerns about the future of employment, of public debates about automation, and of internal tensions over work rhythms, job reconversion, and the need for constant training to keep up with the new tools. From a strategic point of view, Walmart assumed that in a world where Amazon and other competitors were investing enormous amounts in automation, staying on the sidelines would have meant giving up part of its historical advantage in costs. So its philosophy moved along a delicate line, trying to adopt technologies that improved efficiency without completely breaking the fabric of employment in communities where the store was one of the major employers, something that forced the company to talk increasingly about retraining, internal mobility, and the idea that retail work in the future would be different from the times of Sam Walton, even though the essence of commerce would continue to be serving the customer. Seen from a certain distance, this era of robots, drones, and intelligent stores shows a Walmart very different from that of the 1960s, but faithful to a deeper intuition. Any improvement in the way products are moved, organized, and sold can translate into a few cents less in the final price, and those cents, multiplied by millions of transactions, make the difference in a model that has always bet on volume, while reinforcing a less visible but equally real aspect: the growing scrutiny over how these transformations affect workers, suppliers, and entire communities, a tension that will become increasingly evident as the giant advances toward a stage where ethical and social matters will weigh as much as technical innovation. a giant under constant scrutiny. In recent years, when Walmart had already become an actor so large that any decision it made left a trace far beyond a single city or a single country, the conversation around the company began to grow more complex, more charged with nuances, because it was no longer enough to talk about sales, store openings, or logistical innovations. It became increasingly common to hear its name in debates about inequality, corporate power, environmental sustainability, fair wages, and the future of work, as if the giant of Bentonville had transformed, almost unintentionally, into a mirror where many people look at the effects of contemporary capitalism. On one hand, the company presented itself to the world with a more polished and sophisticated discourse than in previous decades. It spoke about corporate responsibility, commitment to communities, climate objectives, investments in renewable energies, programs to reduce food waste, and projects to support small agricultural producers, especially in emerging markets, where the promise was to offer them access to a global distribution chain and more stable conditions than those they found with traditional intermediaries, a narrative that sought to show a Walmart conscious of the impact of every decision beyond the purely economic quarterly result. Within this narrative, examples were repeated of stores that operated with part of their energy generated from solar panels, of distribution centers that reduced emissions by optimizing truck routes and improving refrigeration efficiency, of public commitments to advance toward more sustainable packaging and to work with suppliers who met certain environmental standards, and of internal initiatives to minimize waste, reuse materials, and measure with precision the impact of every link in the logistical chain on the company's overall carbon footprint. In parallel, the company began giving greater visibility to the improvements in working conditions that, over time, it adopted, announcing increases in its internal minimum wage, expansion of certain health and education benefits, training programs so that employees could retrain for more qualified positions within Walmart itself, and efforts to diversify leadership teams, including more women and people from minority groups in managerial roles. All of this accompanied by grand statements about the intention to become the best possible employer for millions of workers in retail. However, alongside this official discourse, the other side of the narrative remained very much alive, the one that came through the testimonies of employees who continued to report wages insufficient to cover the cost of living in certain cities, fragmented schedules that made it difficult to organize family life, pressure to increase productivity in stores or distribution centers, and a persistent feeling that, despite improvements, a large portion of the workforce lived in a fragile balance, especially at entry levels, where each extra hour or each change in the schedule could mark the difference between reaching the end of the month with a positive balance or not. In the union arena, tension remained a constant thread. Walmart continued to defend a model of direct relationship with its employees, rejecting the idea of unions as formal intermediaries and relying on internal communication channels and programs that, according to the company, allowed it to hear workers' concerns without the need for external structures. But union movements and labor organizations continued to denounce practices they interpreted as deterrence tactics, fear campaigns, and maneuvers to avoid free voting in centers where collective representation was being organized. So each unionization attempt became a case study, followed closely by media and activists. In the realm of the global supply chain, criticisms took on an equally intense tone. Reports from independent organizations highlighted the pressure that the low-price policy exerted on factories in low-wage countries, where the quest for minimal costs could translate into excessive workdays, unsafe conditions, or wages far below a standard considered decent. And although Walmart responded with audits, codes of conduct for suppliers, verification programs, and even contract cancellations in serious cases, the feeling was that, in such an extensive network, each advance was accompanied by new problems appearing in other parts of the map. Another front of constant scrutiny revolved around the impact that the company has on the communities where it settles. A debate that already dated back decades, but that became more sophisticated over time, because researchers began analyzing not only the immediate snapshot of what happens when a Walmart opens in a town, with new jobs and the closing of traditional businesses, but also the long-term film, how average wages in the area change, what happens to local suppliers who cannot enter the chain, how the social fabric transforms when commercial life shifts to a large parking lot on the outskirts instead of remaining on the streets of the town center. Faced with all this pressure, the company refined its communication and reputation management strategy, increasing transparency in certain indicators, publishing detailed reports on its environmental and social progress, establishing long-term goals that could be evaluated by investors and the general public, and participating in global forums where large corporations discuss their role in issues such as climate change, poverty reduction, or sustainable development, positioning itself as an actor that, given its size, cannot limit itself to going with the flow but has the capacity to influence the direction of that flow. In the financial world, this shift towards sustainability and corporate social responsibility was not merely a question of image. It was closely linked to the growing weight of investors who apply environmental, social, and governance criteria at the moment of deciding where to place their capital. Funds that analyze not only sales figures, but also labor policies, emission reduction plans, and ethical risk management, so Walmart had to learn to speak in that language as well, approaching a base of shareholders for whom long-term profitability goes hand in hand with better management of social impact. In the political sphere, the company remained a constant presence, supporting certain causes, financing campaigns or lobbying efforts, and taking positions on some controversial issues, from policies on firearm sales in its stores to decisions related to sensitive products that could polarize customers, and each step in that field was examined under a magnifying glass by pressure groups of different ideological tendencies, turning Walmart into a board where cultural battles are projected that at times transcend completely the world of retail. From an entrepreneurial perspective, what is interesting about this stage is that it shows how, when a company reaches certain dimensions, its room for maneuver becomes filled with invisible constraints. Each technological innovation, each change in wages, each decision about which supplier to choose ceases to be a purely internal matter and becomes a subject of public debate, and the company's leadership must grow accustomed to managing a number of variables that goes far beyond margins and costs. It includes perceptions, collective expectations, and internal and external pressures that rarely align perfectly. Despite this constant scrutiny, or perhaps precisely because of it, Walmart has adapted its discourse and its practices to present itself as a giant that tries to learn while moving, that tries to correct excesses of the past, that seeks a balance between the brutal demands of the market and a certain idea of social justice. Although the result is often imperfect and full of tensions, something clearly perceived when listening to the voices of those who consider it a positive force in areas where little private investment dares to enter, compared with those who see it as an actor too large to move without causing collateral damage. And while the company moves along that tightrope between admiration for its efficiency and criticism for its side effects, a reality is taking shape in which Walmart can no longer be defined solely as a giant supermarket or a chain of discount stores, because its role in the economy, in society, and in the digital and data ecosystem of the 21st century places it in a different category, that of everyday infrastructure that blends with technology, finance, advertising, and even services, opening the door to a phase in which the debate is no longer only about how much it sells, but what kind of world it helps build with each strategic decision. From rural discount to data empire. When looking at Walmart in the decade of the 2020s, it is difficult to recognize in that network of physical stores, digital platforms, automated centers, membership programs, and international partnerships the small experiment that began in Rogers, Arkansas, because what exists today is no longer only a chain of supermarkets. It is a structure that extends across several continents, that directly and indirectly employs millions of people, that operates under different brands in countries such as Mexico or India, and that handles such a volume of information about consumer habits that, in practice, it has become one of the great databanks of the everyday behavior of the global middle class. In the United States, the brand remains almost synonymous with daily shopping, with tens of millions of households walking through its aisles each week or interacting with its mobile application to order food, fill the pantry, replace the living room television, or request a medicine. And in markets such as Mexico, where it operates as a dominant actor in modern retail, Walmart's presence is felt in working-class neighborhoods and in high-income areas, with formats that range from the hypermarket to compact stores oriented toward quick purchases, an adaptation that shows that the old idea of going where others do not go evolved into being where the customer really lives, whether in a small town or in a megacity. In parallel, The commitment to India through the participation in Flipkart and the constant evolution of its operations in Latin America and other markets have reinforced the sense that the giant no longer thinks only in terms of national borders. Its strategic mind moves across maps where routes of merchandise that cross oceans are drawn. Flows of capital that are assigned to regions based on their growth potential are tracked, and matrices of political, regulatory, and social risk that influence every expansion decision are analyzed. All of this operates under a premise that still strongly echoes Sam Walton, finding the customer who watches every coin and giving that person such a compelling value proposition that looking elsewhere becomes difficult. The great difference compared to the early years is that today the fuel of that engine is no longer only logistical talent or the ability to negotiate with suppliers. It is information, the fine-grained knowledge of what people buy, at what moment of the month, how frequently certain products are combined, how much they respond to a one-time discount, and how much they are influenced by a recommendation on the screen. In this way, Walmart transforms itself, little by little, into a company where the line between retail and technology becomes increasingly blurry. With teams of advanced analytics and artificial intelligence playing a growing role in decision-making, this knowledge is monetized in ways that, 20 years ago, would have been surprising for many outside observers. For example, through the sale of advertising inside its own digital and physical ecosystem, a business that turns Walmart into a kind of silent media outlet that decides which brands appear in privileged positions when a user searches for detergent in the application, which products are highlighted on the in-store signage screens, or which campaigns are activated in a hyper-segmented manner for members of Walmart Plus with specific consumption patterns, all supported by the ability to demonstrate to advertisers something that traditional marketing always dreamed of offering: a direct connection between the impact of advertising and the actual purchase at the checkout. Along the same lines, the giant has begun to flirt with light financial services, from cards and payment solutions integrated into the shopping experience, to partnerships offering accounts or basic credit products to customers who, in many cases, have limited access to traditional banking. And although the declared objective is to make the consumer's life easier and offer low-cost alternatives, from a strategic perspective it also means capturing an additional portion of the economic flow that passes through the brand, being present before, during, and after the moment of the purchase, and reinforcing the idea of Walmart as an integral economic environment rather than an isolated stop. This movement toward becoming infrastructure is also reflected in how the company itself speaks about its identity to investors and the media, emphasizing its condition as a platform that integrates physical commerce, electronic commerce, services, data, and technology, highlighting milestones such as its change of listing to the Nasdaq, a symbol of closeness to the universe of companies perceived as technological, and underscoring each advancement in automation, artificial intelligence, or advertising as part of a narrative in which Walmart presents itself no longer as the old brick-and-mortar giant modernizing reluctantly, but as an actor fully aware of the digital revolution and determined to play a leading role in it. For the everyday customer, many of these transformations are perceived in a fragmented way: an application that remembers purchased products and suggests lists, a parking lot pickup process that saves time, a content offering included in the membership, a digital coupon that appears just when it is time to restock diapers, a shopping experience that, compared to that of 2 decades ago, feels more fluid, more integrated, and more personalized, even though the physical store environment, with its functional aesthetic and shelves filled to the brim, retains a familiar air that connects with the imagination of previous generations. Behind that apparent continuity, however, lies a profound change, because each consumer gesture, each step down an aisle, each click on the screen, leaves a trail that feeds statistical models capable of guiding future investments, of deciding which store formats will grow and which will shrink, of determining whether it is advisable to open a new logistics center in a specific region or intensify partnerships with third parties. And that level of sophistication makes Walmart's leadership, today, an exercise in managing complex systems that would have been difficult to imagine for that Sam Walton who flew in a small aircraft to visit stores and took notes in a notebook. From the perspective of entrepreneurship, the journey from the small rural store to the data empire raises an interesting reflection. A company with a very simple purpose, offering low prices to underserved communities, has managed to remain relevant for more than half a century because it has been capable of changing almost everything except that core. It has adapted formats, technologies, internal structures, and even its public image, but it always returns to the same point when it has to make strategic decisions, asking what must be done so that the shopping cart costs less for the customer, and so that those savings make the customer choose it again and again over any alternative, whether a neighborhood supermarket, a pure digital platform, or a mixture of both. Of course, that success raises uncomfortable questions that will continue to be relevant in the coming years. To what extent is it desirable that a single company concentrates so much information about the daily consumption of millions of people? What limits should be placed on the negotiating power of an actor that can tilt the balance of an entire industry with a single decision? How can the promise of low prices be made compatible with wages and working conditions that are perceived as fair? And what additional responsibilities does a giant have when, in practical terms, it has become as important for the daily life of many communities as a road, an electrical grid, or a communication system? What seems clear is that, by this point, Walmart has become something more complex than a simple case of business success. It is a prism through which to observe how the economy changes when data becomes raw material, when logistics are automated, when the boundary between physical and digital blurs, and when the decisions of a leadership committee in Bentonville can alter the life of a farmer in Mexico, a worker in India, or a family in any American suburb. And that condition as an invisible infrastructure of everyday life suggests that, while society debates the kind of future it wants to build, the giant of rural discount will continue moving its pieces quietly, adjusting prices, algorithms, and formats to remain, once again, one step ahead of the competition and close enough to the customer to remain part of the routine. And this is the end of this journey through the history of Walmart, from the small-town store to the empire we know today. If anything you have heard has made you think, I would love to read your thoughts in the comments. Tell me which part of the story surprised you the most. Thank you for joining me for another night. Good night.